Before sunrise, bulldozers line the street. Most of the block is still asleep. A man stands on the curb in his work shirt, holding a folded notice that smells like ink. By noon, the first house collapses. By next year, the entire neighborhood will be gone. The first wall does not fall like a movie. It shudders, it cracks, it leans, then it folds into a cloud that turns daylight into grit. Men in hard hats wave their arms, guiding the machine forward, as if they are directing weather. Across the street, another man watches from his front steps. He keeps one hand on the doorframe, like the house might pull him back inside if he lets go. The paper in the hand of the first man is the reason the machines are here. It is a condemnation notice. The city has marked this property for acquisition. The route has been chosen. The deadline has been set. A neighborhood does not die in one morning. It dies in stages. First, it is renamed on a map. Then it is measured. Then it is divided into parcels, values, and signatures. Only after that do the machines arrive. To understand why a street can be cleared like a battlefield, go back to the time before the line was drawn. In St. Paul, Minnesota, there was a stretch of blocks where storefronts sat close enough that neighbors could cross the street mid-sentence. The avenue had barbers, tailors, cafes, small groceries, and insurance offices with hand-painted signs. Church doors opened early and closed late. Basement rooms held meetings and meals, the kind that left the smell of coffee in the wood for days. For many black residents of St. Paul, this neighborhood was not just a place to live. It was where a person could find a landlord who would rent, an employer who would hire, and a banker who would not laugh. In a country where housing and opportunity were often blocked by policy and by custom, the neighborhood became a shield. It was called Rondo. Rondo was not perfect. Some houses leaned with age, some sidewalks cracked, but the street was alive. If you stood on the corner at dusk, you could hear doors closing, radios murmuring, and footsteps returning from work. A streetcar bell could cut through the air, then fade behind the hum of traffic. People knew who owned the shop on the next block and who needed help when winter came. By the 1930s, another sound was growing louder: cars. Commuters wanted to move faster between downtown St. Paul and Minneapolis. Engineers looked at the map and saw a corridor. Business leaders saw time saved. Elected officials saw a project that could be sold as progress. They talked about a highway linking the Twin Cities. Then came World War II and the years after it, when the United States built outward. More cars, more suburbs, more demand for asphalt and concrete. Traffic jams became an argument. If the streets were crowded, the solution was presented as a bigger street. If neighborhoods were dense, the solution was presented as clearing space. In the mid-1950s, the idea became a federal promise. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 created a national interstate system, funded through a trust fund built on fuel taxes and other highway user taxes. The federal government would cover 90% of the cost for interstate projects. States would pay the rest. Money at that scale does not just build roads. It pulls cities toward a decision. In St. Paul, city engineers had already been studying routes. They chose a path along St. Anthony Avenue, a corridor that cut through the heart of Rondo. On paper, it looked efficient. It avoided expensive downtown properties. It fit the geometry highway designers wanted: long, straight segments, wide curves, limited access. On the ground, the corridor was not empty. It was houses, storefronts, churches, and lives, arranged block by block. The first crack came quietly. Survey crews appeared with tripods and measuring chains. Stakes went into lawns. Paint marks appeared on curbs. Letters arrived with official seals, inviting residents to meetings, explaining that a new road was coming, promising fair treatment. In church basements and community halls, people sat on folding chairs and listened to men in suits talk about the future. The future was drawn in clean lines. The drawings did not include the smell of bread from a corner store, or the way neighbors checked on one another when the temperature dropped. The drawings did not include what happens to a business built on foot traffic when the street becomes a trench. Residents organized fast. Leaders emerged, including Reverend Floyd Massey Jr. and Timothy Howard. They formed the Rondo St. Anthony Improvement Association, a group that tried to do what the map would not do: make the neighborhood visible to the people holding the pens. They protested the route. They demanded help for property owners and renters who would be forced to move. The city listened just enough to keep the project moving. Officials attended meetings. They nodded. They explained constraints. They said the route was the best option. They said the federal money required standards. They said delay would increase costs. They said they would treat everyone fairly. Fairness became a formula. Appraisers came to homes and wrote down measurements, room counts, roof conditions. They assessed the market value of buildings that had been undervalued for years by discriminatory lending and by neighborhood stigma. They calculated a price for a life built inside four walls. If a homeowner disagreed, the process did not stop. There were hearings, deadlines, and paperwork that required time, education, and legal help. Many people did not have those resources, and even when the offer rose, the market outside Rondo was not open. A check did not guarantee a new home in a better neighborhood. It only guaranteed that the old home would be taken. Stores faced a different trap. A shop can be moved in theory, but a shop is also its corner, its sidewalk, its rhythm of customers. When the notice arrived, some owners tried to find new storefronts. Rents were higher elsewhere. Loans were harder to get. Some businesses closed before the bulldozers arrived, as if they were trying to die quietly. The second stage was administrative: clipboards and file cabinets, maps with colored routes, stacks of forms stamped approved, condemnation notices mailed in batches. Each letter turned a home into a problem to be processed. The third stage was isolation. When enough people leave, a block feels different. Windows go dark. A porch stays empty. The neighborhood begins to look like the labels the planners used: blighted, obsolete. In the files, those words justify the next step. In September of 1956, the wrecking crews arrived. They started where resistance was weakest and where the schedule demanded speed. A man could still stand in his kitchen and smell the coffee from yesterday. Outside, the machines were already warming up. Some residents did not go quietly. One of them was Reverend George Davis. When he refused to leave his home, police removed him. It was a calm display of authority: uniforms, hands on arms. A man guided out of the doorway while his house waited behind him for the next step. After that, the street understood what was coming. Not a debate, a procedure. The demolition followed a pattern. First, utilities were cut. Then doors were marked. Then roofs were torn open. A house that had held decades of conversation became a pile in an afternoon. People carried what they could: suitcases, boxes, ledgers, photographs, a coffee tin filled with letters, a worn key that would no longer fit any lock. In temporary rooms across the city, residents wrote new addresses on envelopes and tried to sleep. They walked unfamiliar streets to buy groceries. They searched for churches where faces were not yet known. Meanwhile, the trench grew. Earth was scraped away. Soil was piled into mounds. Concrete forms appeared like ribs. Steel rebar rose in grids. Day after day, the corridor that had once been a neighborhood became an engineered void. This was not only a St. Paul story. Across the United States, cities were remade by the same logic: Highways were routed through neighborhoods officials considered easy to take. Often those neighborhoods were home to black residents and other marginalized communities. Land was cheaper. Residents had less political power. Opposition could be managed. The federal government did not select every route, but the funding structure rewarded speed and compliance. The interstate standards demanded width, curvature, and limited access. To meet those standards in built-up areas, something had to be cleared. In many cities, the thing that was cleared was the neighborhood that could least afford to lose ground. When Interstate 94 opened in 1968, the corridor between St. Paul and Minneapolis became a ribbon of concrete. On maps, it was a clean line. On the ground, it was noise, exhaust, and distance. A person standing on one side of the highway could see the other side, but the crossing points were limited. The street grid that had once offered dozens of casual paths became a set of controlled passages. Underpasses felt narrow and dark. Overpasses carried traffic that never stopped. The businesses that had depended on walk-in customers were gone. The churches that had anchored blocks had moved or closed. Neighbors who had once lived within a few minutes of one another were scattered across the city and beyond it. Community ties weakened, not because people stopped caring, but because distance is a slow thief. The loss was not only social, it was financial. Homes are a primary way households build wealth in the United States. When a home is taken at an undervalued price and the replacement market is higher and more restricted, the gap becomes permanent. A highway does not just remove buildings, it interrupts a future. Years later, the physical scar remained. The sound of tires over concrete became a constant. In winter, wind moved through the corridor like a channel. In summer, heat rose from the road and settled over nearby blocks. People adapted, because people always adapt. New routines formed. Some residents built lives in other neighborhoods. Some held on to memories like possessions, carrying them from room to room, refusing to let them be dismissed as nostalgia. The city moved on. Officials praised the highway as a success. Traffic flowed. Economic development shifted toward interchanges and parking lots. The story of what was removed became a footnote in planning documents. But the footnote did not stay quiet. Former residents kept speaking the name. They gathered to remember. They told stories about storefronts, about music, about the way a community can exist inside a few blocks when the outside world is hostile. They refused to let the highway be the final narrator. In archives, the evidence sits in boxes. Maps that show the route decision, meeting minutes that record polite objections, photographs of a street before and after, appraisal forms with neat handwriting, reducing a home to measurements, police reports that describe removal as procedure. The documents do not capture everything. They do not capture the silence after a block empties. They do not capture the feeling of stepping into a house for the last time, knowing the next person through the door will be a worker with a crowbar. But they show enough to make one point. This did not happen by accident. It happened because policy made it possible. Money made it attractive. Power made it difficult to stop. The bulldozers at sunrise were not the start. They were the final step in a chain of decisions. Each decision had a signature. Each signature had a justification. Each justification used the language of progress. Progress for the commuter looks like minutes saved. Progress for the planner looks like a clean line that meets a federal standard. Progress for the resident can look like a front door that opens to a void. The story of Rondo is not the only one. It is a pattern. A national project that promised mobility, built on sacrifice that was not shared equally. If a city can erase a neighborhood with paperwork and machinery, what does it owe to the people who were moved? Can a place be rebuilt after it has been cut in half? Or does the road keep taking? long after the dust has settled.